Stephan, how are you?
Hey, Peter. Yeah, I'm doing well.
Right. We have a Libertarian President in place. How do you feel about this?
I think it's remarkable. It's the first time we've seen an explicitly anarcho-capitalist head of state in the world. So I think it's a remarkable step in terms of liberty and the philosophy getting a certain level of exposure that it had never gotten before. And I think this may be the new wave, right? If people think about Ron Paul in 2008 and in 2012, this may be the next big wave, potentially. Now, of course, there's things that could go wrong here too, but also I think it's fair to say that this is a big step forward in terms of awareness about the ideology and philosophy of libertarianism.
Well, listen, this is a show I had to make. So I got on the phone with Danny as soon as he was elected. I said, "Look, we've got to make a show on this," and he was like, "Who do you want to make it with?" I was like, "Stephan, definitely Stephan." I was like, "We have butted heads now for about 5 years, where there's like things we agree on and disagree on, and sometimes argue about. But it was kind of like this meeting of all your ideas, but they came through. I'm a pro-democracy person, and so it came through a democratic process." So I was like, I even privately messaged you. So I was kind of like, Stephan's the person I've got to talk to because I've got so many questions about this. So interestingly, like, how closely have you been following him? And in your world, your anarcho-capitalistic world, how much does he align? Because I know there can be a lot of differences.
Sure. So in terms of how long has this guy been on my radar? Probably the last 6 months or so. Like, people were sort of talking about this guy. Now, as you obviously know, I'm an English-speaking person. I'm not fluent in Spanish, and so for that reason, I wasn't as familiar with him. But from what I've read of him, it sounds like he sort of came up over the last few years as a commentator, going on these shows and basically arguing with statists about politics and economics. And the funny thing is, as you mentioned, in terms of the broad, let's say, church of libertarianism, or the broad, a big tent of libertarianism, he's coming from the specifically Austrian economics, let's say, wing or part of that. Now, of course, I have some disagreements with him, maybe on the foreign policy aspects, but for the most part, it seems like he aligns with what many Austrian libertarians and Austrian anarcho-capitalists would believe. Of course, I think, as you can probably appreciate, sometimes in certain circles online, there can be a lot of purity testing about exactly how much you follow the ideology. And this can even happen even in Bitcoin circles, right? I'm sure you see online people sometimes, they sort of compete about how hardcore they can be, about how many coin joins they can do, and how much multi-sig, and how hardcore they are with their security, and how hardcore they are about running their Bitcoin node. Now, of course, I encourage people to do these things, but I'm not as much of a, like, to the nth degree purity testing. And I think the same thing can exist in libertarianism, where people can sort of be like, "Oh, see, I agree with you on 95% of things, but this last 5%, it's unforgivable." And people can sometimes miss the forest for the trees.
Which is ridiculous when you have got a... So what should I be saying? Should I be saying he's anarcho-capitalist or libertarian? Or are they interchangeable?
I see them as... So I see libertarianism is the broader category, and anarcho-capitalism is, let's say, one type of libertarian. And you also have minarchist libertarians who believe in a small state solution. Now, I think Javier Milei has said philosophically he's an anarcho-capitalist, but in practice, in pragmatic terms, he's more like a minarchist in terms of what are the policies that he's actually going to be trying to drive. So, I think it's a fair position to take realistically, given that, you need time for people to sort of get familiar with that idea of, a society where we've privatized everything.
Okay, so what is it that makes you a statist? Everyone calls me a statist, but he has come to power through a democratic process, and he will lead a party in government. So what part of that isn't statist? So I understand.
Yeah, and it's a fair question, right? Because you could say, "Well, hang on, is that a contradiction in terms?" Right? An anarchist who is trying to be the president of a nation state and presumably is going to be, giving orders within that nation state? It's a fair question. I think the way I would answer that is he fundamentally is attempting to reduce the size of the state, right? And as I'm sure you might have seen, and listeners may have seen some of the clips or the memes of exactly the kinds of things he's saying, right? He's gone on shows saying things like, F the state, and I wipe my behind with the state. And, it's funny because sometimes people sort of accuse people who are excited about this of being statists. But if there's one candidate who is out here saying F the state and I wipe my ass with the state, I mean, if that guy is there going in and trying to reduce the size of the state, trying to lower the taxes, trying to get rid of the regulation, trying to bring about free trade, explicitly saying he wants to end central banking, well, then I think you can be excused a little bit. Of course, you have to see what he does in practice, right? Of course, politicians, you can't really trust them. Of course, they could say one thing and do another. But fundamentally, I think the important point that I would make is that this philosophy has now gotten to this level that a person who explicitly calls himself a libertarian has now become president of a nation as important as Argentina with a population of 45 million people. And I think it's important to point out here that there's a lot of people who are trying to discredit him, or they're trying to use these terminology like, oh, he's far right, or he's Trump-like, or he's fiery, or whatever these terms are. I think libertarianism is not really far right. It really is a different category. Right now, historically, libertarians sort of use the term liberal or classical liberal. Now, of course, that term liberal can mean different things. In the American context, it probably means more like a leftist nowadays. So for better or worse, the term libertarian and the ideology of libertarianism is now going to be a lot more prominent. People are at least going to look at it in the same way that when, Bitcoin got adopted by El Salvador, it sort of made it, it made it more credible in the eyes of other people, or quote unquote normal people who've not been exposed to these ideas before.
Well, I guarantee you here in the UK, the majority of people have never even heard of libertarianism. And if they have, they probably don't really know what it means. Boris Johnson always said he was a libertarian. He wasn't. He's a conservative politician. And so he's actually created a marketing platform for libertarian ideas, which I think is super cool. I'll tell you what I like about it is, how much I've wrestled with this over the years. And the thing I've always wrestled with the most is the idea of no state. Just like, how does it work? And is there a power vacuum? And do you ultimately give up democracy and replace it with tyranny? I've always worried about that. And I've always questioned, well, how do you get a libertarian country? And I've always thought, why don't the libertarians create political parties? Why don't they fight for power? And so this is where it's kind of interesting, because it has happened. And you now have a libertarian in place here in Argentina. And actually, by the way, it's the 24th largest it's 23rd largest economy in the world still. And so I think it's super interesting. One of the questions I would put to you is, and I don't know if there's a direct answer or it's particularly nuanced, but would you, in your ideal world, would he completely dismantle the state, or would he go more the minarchist approach and try and make it as small as possible? Is there an answer to that?
So this comes to, and you may have come across this also, there's this kind of concept in libertarianism or libertarian circles where they talk about this idea of the red button. Would you press that red button and just eliminate the state entirely? And so I guess, if you ask me the question just straight up, yes, ideally I would press that red button. That would be the idealistic answer. I would do it personally. But I understand there's the world that I would like to see, and there's the world that I think is likely. Now, what is likely is that he's going to just go in there and take a more minarchist approach. And you know what? With Argentina coming from such a low, that will cause a huge win. There's so much low-hanging fruit here that he could take away regulation relating to free trade. He could end the central bank. He could abolish various departments with these government workers who, many of them are just not really doing productive things, and they are in fact being a burden. They're like an albatross hanging on the economy of Argentina. So I see it as, look, to answer your question, yes, I would press the button, I would eliminate the state, but I understand that that's not the likely pathway. And also I will note that in this case now, to be clear, I do not consider myself an expert on Argentina, but I've done a little bit of reading. My understanding is he he holds a smaller number of seats in terms of the Senate and the House. So I believe he holds 8 Senate seats and 37 House seats. The Peronista coalition holds 34 of 72 Senate seats and 108 of 257 House seats. So Milei will have to govern by coalition. There will be limited things that he can do by executive order. And so that means, theoretically, he wouldn't even have the power to sort of press the red button anyway. But there will be a lot of opportunity for trying to fix this crisis that Argentina is going through.
So because I don't know about this as well. So did he win the popular vote, but his party, did they have a vote for a president and then a vote for party seats?
Right. So as I understand, his party only holds 8 Senate seats and 37 House seats. And I think when they have the next midterm, maybe there's an opportunity for him to take that up a bit more. If he's doing a good job and able to win more power, then maybe that's one pathway. And I think he made a point similar to how Bukele, when Bukele over in El Salvador was first voted in, that he wasn't necessarily voted in with a massive 90% of the seats or something like that. That he had to sort of grow to that level. So I think obviously there will be parallels being drawn now between Milei and Bukele and, let's say, Bolsonaro from Brazil. There are big differences between all of them, but I think Milei is obviously the one who is most explicitly talking about Austrian economics and anarcho-capitalism.
Yeah, I think the comparison to Bolsonaro and Trump themselves are particularly lazy because I think they're personality comparisons. I don't think they're policy comparisons. You don't have to spend particularly long to realize they come from a different place in terms of policy. I think that's purely on I think that's purely on the personality side. And we had an article that came out about 8 hours before the election in the UK, referring to it's in the Guardian, of course, referring to Milei as extreme right. And I sent you a screenshot just when I put something up on Facebook about a libertarian being elected. And, the first comment was somebody saying, they forgot the far right, extreme right. I think they're particularly, it's lazy.
Yeah, and I'm with you. And I think there's one other point that's important to make here, because I think there are some, let's say, MAGA conservative, Make America Great Again types who are sort of heralding this. And maybe there's some superficial level of agreement in terms of that you would say they're both anti-woke, let's say. But there's actually a lot of differences between, let's say, a typical MAGA person and a typical libertarian person, right? Because a typical libertarian person is looking to reduce the power of the state. He's not trying to give money to particular industries. He's, there are some, when you really look at the policies, he's different from a Trump or a Bolsonaro. Another big example would be a MAGA person might be very pro tariffs and industry protectionism and subsidies, whereas a principled libertarian is going to be trying to reduce those or remove those, right? A common thing, and this is another thing that's interesting, is oftentimes they'll call it a free trade agreement, but in actual fact, free trade is often managed trade. So in practice, it says, you're allowed to trade with this other country on this, and that proviso, with this import duty and this particular regulation, when in actual fact, it would be beneficial for countries to go to a more unilateral free trade approach. And that's actually what Milei has spoken about, this idea of just having unilateral free trade and stopping this idea that you need to regulate the trade between the nations. Now, Milei has made some overtures that he doesn't like to negotiate or talk with communist people, and there's been a little bit of back and forth between him and Lula, the leader in Brazil. But nevertheless, I think even if that's happening at the government level, I think Milei is sort of having this idea that, well, if you're a business in Argentina, that doesn't stop you trading with a business in Brazil. So, and that's actually a little bit more aligned with how a libertarian is viewing it. So there's some interesting differences there between the libertarians and the MAGA types.
Yeah, and just going back to the big red button, because I read an article once that Scott Horton wrote about this.
Yeah.
And he's actually against the big red button. He thinks it's too fast, it's like ripping off the Band-Aid. It's too fast, it's too bloody, too dangerous. I guess from my side, I would see it as the big red button would be kind of risky. If he moves too fast, it may cause too much pain that you could see protests, another maybe different type of populist revolution, because there's certainly a large part of the Argentinian population that rely on government handouts. And so my kind of view is that if he's going to reduce the size of state, it might make sense to do it a bit more slowly and almost like a A/B test your way through it.
So this is actually the argument. So to be clear, there's a lot of disagreement amongst libertarians on this issue. I can't give you this is the answer. There's disagreement here. But one of the arguments in favor of the big red button, now I can't recall who, sadly, I can't remember who wrote that article. It might be Murray Rothbard, but one of the arguments about it is that what happens in practice if you try to end up doing this incremental, slowly but surely approach, you end up getting captured, or you end up sort of trying to do this gradualism approach, and then you just end up sort of reversing back into having a big state anyway, because every time you try to do something, there's kind of an opportunity for somebody to sort of interrupt you and say, well, we need a regulation for that, or we need the government subsidy for this. You can't just end it. And so that's where this disagreement lies, that actually it would be the pathway to actually get it done, as opposed to getting caught in this sort of regulatory morass or this sort of big state morass as it happens. But that is the argument between libertarians there.
Is that because the state always centralizes? It's an organic structure that always grows.
And think about it like this, right? People have this conception that libertarians are kind of pro big business. In actual fact, it almost might be the other way around, right? Yes, of course, from an economics perspective, we like economies of scale, and certainly that's there. But what happens in practice is when you have a big state, people want to control that big state. And big business often allies with the state to serve their own interests. And that's what we saw even with things like the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, that big bankers were trying to sort of make this case of why they needed the state, because it became a way for the state to give them protection that they would not otherwise have in a truly free market. And so that's why there's this kind of confusion where sometimes people who are coming from a more left statist view can look at the libertarian saying, oh, see, you're just shilling for the big business, when it's actually the other way around. It's actually that we don't want there to be this kind of big territorial monopolist of law and order and taxation, which is the state, to be there, because what happens is when it does exist, people want to command that thing, and then they want to use it to their own benefit, right? Because a lot of people have this conception, and I can almost, it's hard to blame them in some ways, because in their mind, they think of it like, oh, we just need to bring it back. We either need to just get the right guy in charge, or we just need to have a less corrupt government, right? And most people would probably agree with that, right? If you said, oh, would you like the government to just be less corrupt? Yeah, obviously. But the challenge is, how do you achieve that? Because in practice, you can't take the money out of the politics, right? That's another one, right? They say this kind of, oh, imagine if we could just take the money out of politics. It's like, no, they are irrevocably tied together. And it's only by reducing the power of the state, or ideally eliminating the state and having a fully free market, privatized everything, that you can achieve that idea. And so that's probably an answer as to why, or a common confusion that comes up with this idea of libertarianism and their relationship with the state.
So is there a lot of excitement now, a lot of discussion and debate in libertarian circles about this?
Absolutely, yes. So we are seeing various posts of people saying congratulations to Javier Milei. They're saying things like, okay, please make sure you get the full reserve banking law in, or, because a lot of libertarians, we all have our kind of issue that we're kind of big on. Obviously, I'm in the Bitcoin world, so I'm obviously would love to see something that relates to Bitcoin. Of course, the principled answer would be take away all government control over money. There's no need for illegal tender laws. Just take all of that away. Let people choose whatever they wish. Take away capital gains tax laws. Take away all banking and money laundering regulations. Let the market decide. Right? That's the principled approach. But there are different libertarians who are, they've got their own issue that they would really like to be addressed. I think there's a few different camps. Let's say there's some people who are just sort of contrarian and just against everything. And my answer to them is sort of like, look, you've got to learn to just take the W. Sometimes you've got to learn to just take the W. Like, yes, nobody's going to be perfect. There's literally nobody you could put up there who everyone would be happy with, right? Even if somehow you could magically just parachute Ron Paul into the presidency of the United States, there'd be some people who disagree. And I think fundamentally you just have to sort of stop playing this kind of perfect purity game and just accept, okay, yeah, broadly speaking, he is a libertarian. Let's see what he can achieve. And so I think that's one aspect. The other aspect I would point out is if he starts to do non-libertarian things, then it's important that libertarians start calling that out and saying, well, hang on, you ran on this platform of being a libertarian, ending the central bank, etc., anti the globalists, anti the WEF, all this kind of thing. Now you're not doing it. So that would be one area. I think that you have to be vigilant because maybe people can get corrupted over time, or maybe they just sort of don't end up achieving what they say they would.
Yeah, well, my assumption is there's going to be a certain amount of give and take he's going to have to play. Some certain games he's going to have to play to move things forward. I guess what would you want him to do first?
Yeah, great question. So as I said, at the executive level, because he's the president, there may be certain executive things that he can do. For example, stripping away certain regulations or orders that relate to presidential powers. So he may be able to just kind of do that on day one. And he has already mentioned that he wanted to shut down, I can't remember the name of the industry, but the department, I think it was Department of...
Was it like 8 of them?
Yeah, so he's already... Yeah, right. So everyone's seen that meme video where he's kind of like stripping away a few departments. So I think... I don't know the full, intricate details, but as I understand, he's coming in December 10th, and I believe he's already slated there's one department that's going to go on day one or, straight away. And so I think shutting down whatever departments, that he can shut down, anything that, longer, like once he sort of gets into dealing with Parliament and the Senate and the House, maybe he can try to remove subsidies. Maybe he can remove labor market regulations that make it difficult for Argentinian entrepreneurs to do business. Maybe he can lower the taxes and lower the spending, right? Like fundamentally, like as a libertarian, you just want to lower the spending, lower the size of the state, lower the taxes, get out of the way, right? That's fundamentally what libertarians would say. Government should just get out of the way, let the private free markets do business, decide things, and there will be times where it's not perfect, but that's life. And there are times where in life sometimes you have to quote unquote bite the bullet, right? You just have to accept, okay, yeah, this is not going to be perfect, but it's involving the government is not going to make it better. In fact, it may make it worse and create a bad incentive for somebody to try to get in power, create a government department, have the size of that department just keep expanding regardless of the actual results that government department has gotten for the people, for the taxpayers and the citizens. So I think those are a few ones. Removing capital flow restrictions, removing subsidies. Obviously, as Bitcoiners, we want him to remove all monetary interventions. Now, he has stated a goal to dollarize the economy, and I know you obviously did a recent documentary, Follow the Money, number 4, I believe. I watched it earlier today. So
thank you.
I think it was a great exploration of what's going on in Argentina and how people on the ground are seeing things. And as you rightly point out, many people in that economy have chosen to dollarize because they don't know of any better, or that's their way to try and protect their purchasing power. Now, of course, I'm a Bitcoiner. I wish everyone would just jump straight to Bitcoin. I'll always promote Bitcoin over stablecoin. I don't promote stablecoins. I promote Bitcoin. But I recognize why some people use stablecoins, right? Like I understand why they do it. I think that's important. That's the concession I would give. But I always promote Bitcoin first, right? If they're able to, if they are able to save, I think Bitcoin is the way you would do it. But I understand that this is a common thing where countries will dollarize, and what happens commonly is maybe some economist from like the Western world gets parachuted in, someone like Steve Hanke or someone, and he'll say, yeah, get a currency board and dollarize. I think that again, so that comes back to what I was saying. What is ideal and what I think is likely. What I think is likely is that someone will get parachuted in and they'll sort of dollarize the economy. But yeah, ideal of course is Bitcoin.
Well, there is something that very anarcho-capitalist happening there anyway. So when I was there's essentially 2 economies. There's the economy and the real economy. And I guess you probably refer me to some writings that have explained why this happens. But people are so squeezed in Argentina in terms of taxations, bureaucracy, regulation. they've essentially got to the point of they can't take it anymore. So they've essentially built this whole separate economy, which it's like a grey economy, and they're just ignoring the state, and they're saying the risk is worth it because I cannot do business and make money operating with the state infrastructure. So what's quite interesting is that it's not like from a standing start they have to develop this new economy because it kind of already exists.
Correct. And I have done, episodes on my show. I did one a little while back with a guy who is in Argentina. Now, he's actually a Dutch guy, but he was talking a little bit about some of this. So you've got the cambios and you have this sort of gray economy, and people were speculating it's anywhere from 40 to 50% of the Argentinian economy just because the taxes and the regulations are that high. And so if Milei can deregulate and lower the taxes, what may happen is that economy will then go back into the quote-unquote white market. And if the taxes are low, people may just end up paying them. And that may end up sort of driving revenue for the Argentinian state. Now, again, not endorsing the taxes, but I'm saying that's what's likely.
Yeah.
And so, currently the Argentinian state makes some of their money out of export, I think, tariffs and things like this. So we'll see what the way to sort of manage out of that, because obviously Milei has mentioned he wants to have no, export, no trade restrictions and things like this. But anyway, to bring it back to your point, yes, there is a big grey market in some of these economies, and what that will do as deregulation occurs is we will start to see a flourishing of things. Because as an example, if you had to be an underground entrepreneur, if you had to sort of hide things, then you can't operate in a very efficient way, right? And I think you saw that even in the example where you were meeting a money changer guy, and you give the guy, in that example, you gave him some tether and he gave you some cash, physical cash. And so, they have to do things in a way where you meet somebody through a friend to get this contact, right? As opposed to, let's say there's just like a store that you can go to, or a foreign currency place, that you go to just explicitly to do this changeover. So those are a few examples. I think there will be an initial pain period, right? I think everyone has to acknowledge that. There is going to be an initial pain period because it's a crisis, right? It's 50 to 60% of the population is in poverty. They've been dealing with over 100% annual inflation for so long. They've had socialism for decades. This Peronist, party bullshit, or legacy or whatever, they've been pushing that agenda for, 50 to 80 years. So it's going to take some time to unwind that damage. And of course, the political games will be played, right? As Massa leaves, they'll make it really hard for Milei and his team to come in and take things over. They'll try to pin things on him and say, well, look, see, it would have been fine if you just kept it with me, because they were sort of living a lie, right? They were living in this beyond their means debt scenario, right? It's the equivalent of the guy who's got all his credit cards maxed out, and he thinks that just by getting another credit card that he can just keep things going, but really he's lying to himself. What he needs to do is get his spending down in check. And in this case, the Argentinian government, it's arguable, but I believe you can make the case that the Argentinian government should actually repudiate the debt. They should just say, look, it's not right that the Argentinian people have to, quote unquote, honor these contracts that were made on their behalf by past leaders. And I understand that can sound like an extreme big step, but it's sort of part of how you could quickly right the ship is by repudiating the debt, lowering the size of the state dramatically as much as you possibly can, and then proceeding from there. Now, that's the ideal. That would be sort of the closer to the ideal pathway, as we've mentioned. Milei may not be able to achieve that given the actual power he has, currently. But in a theoretical sense, that would be the way to sort of quickly try to right the ship.
Is the majority of that debt with the IMF?
I don't know the specific numbers, but yeah.
You're basically saying just default on it.
Yeah, basically. Like in essence, like you would just say, look, it's illegitimate. We are just going to have to, it's living under this. And, I'm sure if, our friend Alex Gladstein will talk about this as well with the debt restructuring and the IMF in his recent book. And, he's been talking about that. So I think it's a similar thing there, that these external debtors can sort of keep people of other countries in chains, in a sense, because they're not earning enough that they can realistically pay it back anytime soon, and they just end up having this sort of beggar thy neighbor policy of constantly taking out a new credit card to pay off the previous credit card, and it's just not a sustainable pathway forward. And it's sort of, that's where taking a little, it's a short-term pain for long-term gain approach that allows you to really actually move forward in a sustainable pathway.
Yeah, I wonder where the pain is on such a decision with a guy who's totally free market anyway, because if they want to dollarize, one of the challenges that I've read is that to dollarize, you need dollars. Most of all, you need dollars in the economy. Are there enough dollars in the economy? Can they get enough dollars in the economy? And if they default on debt, will they get any assistance to dollarize? Does America want them to dollarize? I assume America does. So would they provide them with some support? And this is where I wonder whether he kind of has to do some deals. Maybe he has to speak to the USG. Maybe he has to do something to enable him to dollarize.
I believe that's likely. And I believe he has even mentioned that one of his first flights will be to the United States to sort of negotiate with them. So that's probably a likely pathway. And that may also be where, I think I have some, let's say, foreign policy disagreements on the positions he might have taken, but I also understand where maybe from a cold calculus position, maybe that's why he's taken them, because he wanted to align with the US foreign policy establishment so that they would be more amenable to sort of, not take him out, not take him out, basically. And if they align a little more on the foreign policy objectives, then maybe the US government will be a little more amenable to sort of helping them dollarize in that way. Again, not endorsing it, but recognizing what's likely.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think sometimes we're not walking his shoes. We're not making those decisions, and maybe there's like some practicalities to achieving things he wants to achieve. Because I don't know what the alternative, I guess you would say, is a free market for money creation, that the banks themselves would create money.
Right. So I would just basically say, look, the government should just have nothing to do with money whatsoever or banking whatsoever, and just let the market decide. And then what is likely to happen in that case is probably dollarization, but just from the bottom up, at least for now, until we can get Bitcoinization, which, maybe that's a few more years away. We don't know. But I think that's the likely pathway, because that's what many people in Argentina are doing already, right? They're already going for dollars and cash. But the point being that if you give people a real true choice, right? There's no legal tender laws, no capital gains tax laws. It allows people to really choose what they want as their store of value. Many Argentinians would, under those circumstances, would probably choose dollars because that's what they know, that's what they think of. Of course, more and more of them over time will come to choose Bitcoin because of all the obvious superiorities that Bitcoin has. It's more scarce. It's all the things that you and your listeners are well aware of.
Would you expect in a fully free market that you would get this kind of free banking era that Nick Carter wrote about, where the banks themselves would issue currency too?
Possible, but I would say this sort of gets into one other area of disagreement that I would have, which is around full reserve versus fractional free market, fractional free banking, let's say, where I believe fractional reserve banking to be fraud, and on one count it's fraud. Secondly, it's also ineffective. It causes the economic cycle. So, I don't know how deeply into the detail you want to get into this, but
go for it.
Yeah. Okay. So put it this way. In most circumstances, a lot of people are not aware what's happening when they go to their fiat banks. They think the bank is sort of putting it away and holding it in safekeeping for them. But in practice, really, they're contributing into this system which pyramids the creation of new credit, right? This is fiat fractional reserve. It creates new money every time new loans are created. And so this system, in essence, is backed by the central bank and by government guarantees, things like implicit bailout guarantees, as an example. So if these banks who are going fractional were to go down, government steps in and saves them. That wouldn't exist in a free market. There are no bailouts in Bitcoin. or at least if they are privately funded. They are not state funded and not socialized to everybody. The cost is not socialized to every holder or every user. It's only an individual who chose to bail out or with his own funds recapitalize that bank. And so I believe that having a full reserve law or at least some kind of option. So as an example, let's say you went to the bank and they gave you a choice. Hey, Pete, when you set up this bank account with us, do you want to allow us to lend it out in future as well? And you don't necessarily have, the full reserve aspect, or are you expecting it to be in a full reserve context and we're not allowed to lend it out? And maybe in that case, we would actually charge you some money, but at least it's an explicit upfront thing. So then it's kind of like, at least you're getting an opt-in aspect to this. So Stephan Kinsella has written a little bit about this, about what a potential law could be that could be brought in to sort of at least give people that choice of whether they believe they're opting into a fractional reserve situation or whether they are opting into a full reserve situation. But of course, I think long term, it's all going towards Bitcoin. And so we're going to be in a Bitcoin context. It's just a question of time. It's a matter of time until people realize the superiority of Bitcoin. It's simply a better money. It's simply a better savings technology. It's just simply better.
Are libertarians in general agreement on full reserve banking?
No, this is a big area of disagreement. So
right.
This is a big area. So in the 90s and even early 2000s, there were a lot of back and forth volleys between libertarian economists on this exact question. So in the full reserve camp, you have people like Hans Hermann Hoppe, Joseph Salerno, Guido Hulsmann, Walter Block, and then in the pro-fractional side, you have people like Larry White, George Selgin, and others. I guess in modern day context, you have others like David Howden and Philip Vargas as well, who are also in the full reserve camp. Huerta de Soto is another one in the full reserve camp. So I'm personally in the full reserve camp. I'm sort of on that full reserve camp. Someone like Safedine, he would be in the full reserve camp probably. Whereas let's say someone like, as you mentioned, Nick Carter, he's probably more on the fractional free banker side.
I think Nick said that he just expects that to happen. He said, I don't think you can avoid leverage.
Right. So I think the answer from the full reserve side in that case would be that's fraud, right? Like there should be laws to stop that, right? So it's one thing to have a contract between two people who kind of voluntarily opt into that. But the problem with that is that it involves people who never agreed to that. Right, because when people are forced to use a particular legal tender, right, and this comes back to the problem of legal tender laws, when you're forced to use the US dollar or the Australian dollar or whatever, or the Argentine peso, you're kind of like a forced third party in that agreement. And so the full reserve argument would be, no, you're only allowed to make agreements between you and that other person. You can't force that onto other third parties. And because they're being forced to use that as legal tender, and because they're being forced because of capital gains tax laws, right? Because if you use something else as money, you're going to have to pay capital gains tax every time you transact.
Yeah.
That's not feasible. And that's part of the full reserve. That would be part of the full reservist answer, let's say.
So if you consider that fraud, but others don't, in such a scenario, how do you define what the laws are? How would laws be created? Say you had the big red button. I know there's very limited laws that libertarians want. I think it's mainly to do with
like theft, rape, murder, stealing,
fraud.
Yeah.
It's like the typical violence laws or theft and fraud. But I think violence laws are fairly simple in some ways. But how do you define fraud? Because within your community, there's some people who think it isn't fraud and some who are. Is it the fact that it has to be, it would only be fraud if it wasn't agreed between parties as part of a contract?
So this comes back to what I was saying earlier, that there were some libertarians who were saying, hey, Milei, we want you to get this full reserve law in, because they believe that this is how you prevent theft, right? In their view, you're stopping theft. Now, I'll be clear here. There's 2 points here. There's 2 prongs. One is the people who believe it's fraud, and secondarily, the people who say, even if I gave you that and just said, we don't care if it's fraud or not, we believe it's economically inefficient for the market to have it that way, that it causes the boom and bust cycle, like the dot-com bubble and the great financial crisis, global financial crisis. So there's 2 prongs to it. So you could be of the view that, look, I don't think it's fraud, but I think it's economically inefficient anyway. I also take the view that I think in the future Bitcoin world, it's going to push us towards full reserve just economically as well. But I mean, you've asked the question in terms of how would it be made illegal, and I think it could be enforced by the private defense agencies, right? Murray Rothbard talks about this sort of idea. It could be seen as in this particular society, it's fraud to engage in fractional reserve banking without it at least being an explicit upfront thing. And so that's one way of doing it. Or another interpretation is that it will just be, put it this way, economically enforced, right? That let me make it a quick example. Let's say there is a fractional reserve Bitcoin bank. Lots of people will do a bank run on them, and then they'll get wrecked in the same way that Mt. Gox, FTX, etc. That if somebody tries to go fractional, people who suspect them will do a bank run, and then that will be sort of like a market test or a market check if you're truly full reserve.
Just and we've discussed this before many years ago. Just so I understand there'll be courts of arbitration for people who have broken contracts and committed crimes, but which crimes would be punishable by, say, financial penalties, and which would be punishable, say, by a custodial sentence within a free market prison?
Right. Yeah. So this is another area where there are, various resources I can point you to, but if people are interested, I would say search Bob Murphy Chaos Theory.
Okay.
Another one is Bruce Benson, The Enterprise of Law. So that's a great book. And so I think there's different conceptions of what the law would be like under this hypothetical anarcho-capitalism. Some people say that it would just sort of evolve over time in the same way that language evolves, like a dictionary. There's no one arbiter of the English language, but there's various dictionaries that sort of try to codify what those laws are. And so historically, anarcho-capitalists and legal theorists and philosophers have spoken about this idea where historically there was lex mercatoria, right? The law that related to merchants. And so what was like the common practice? What was the normal culture, right? As an example, like if you and I, we go sit down in a restaurant somewhere, you pick, I want the ribeye steak, and then, they serve you the steak, you eat it, and then they serve you the bill, and you're like, what? I didn't agree to pay for, I just wanted the, it's like, no, there's certain understandings that are just implicit, right? Like you went into the restaurant, you ordered this, you need to pay the $45 for the steak or whatever. I think there'd be certain aspects that are just sort of understood through custom, and there may be other aspects where maybe it's this law applies in this area. So it may be, in the Middle East, this is the custom, and in the Americas, this is the custom. So I think these are all interesting, and we will see evolution and innovation in this also. That we'll see different approaches in terms of arbitration and how it could really work out. But I think to give some kind of a structure, the idea is you might be a judge who's an expert in this particular kind of law, whether it relates to physical property disputes in the Middle East or something like that. And you might be an expert about that area, and you sort of know the precedent and the common law in relation to that. And people come to you because they trust your judgment, because you have a reputation to uphold. And so they're like, oh, Peter McCormack's an expert in real estate in the Americas, so go to him. And people, if they have a dispute, would go to you for that. And so then you might issue down a judgment saying, look, in my professional interpretation, I know I've looked at the facts of the case, I've looked at the history, here's the precedent of the different cases. And based on that, person A, you own this land. And the idea is, parties A and B would have to then say, okay, well, look, Peter McCormack is a reputable judge in this particular area of the law, in this area. We're going to take that. Or maybe they don't, and then they take it and they appeal it somewhere else. And eventually, you're going to get to a point where it's sort of like, it's cheaper to just accept that because you want to play in the broader game of this legal system, because, it's more profitable for us to trade instead of like trying to go to war and fight about it. That's one way of interpreting it. Even though I can't give you kind of an explicit, this is exactly how it's going to work, I can give you kind of a few sketches of what it might look like and what are some of the principles, the contours of what it might look like.
Do you think we're going to see a wave of libertarians move into Argentina? And I could even point that question at you. If he does start to deliver on it, do you think that's going to be a kind of an attractive jurisdiction for you to consider living in?
You know
It's
what?
kind of the world you want.
It could be. It could be. I think obviously there's different aspects we all have to consider, right? Like where our family lives. I don't speak Spanish. I mean, hey, maybe I could learn. But I'd be open to it. Honestly, I would honestly be open to it in the future, right? If because I think Argentina is, even if we could somehow resurrect Murray Rothbard and put him in charge, it would take time to undo all the damage that's been done, right? They didn't get here overnight. They got here after a process of, call it 50, 80 years worth of this stuff. And so it's going to take some time to fix things up. But nevertheless, as you and the listeners may be aware, Argentina used to be a very rich country. And there's nothing in principle that stops them from re-achieving that if the right leadership and governance were to be applied. And so, I would honestly think about it in the future. Maybe not right now, but let's imagine hypothetically, Javier Milei does really well and he gets reelected again, and maybe it's 5 years down the line. It might be an option at that point. I'm not saying I would definitely do it, but yeah, I think so. And here's the other aspect. I think it's going to inspire libertarians and Bitcoiners around the world. More and more people will start saying, well, hang on, they did it over there and it worked, So I think that is another aspect where it helps libertarians and the cause of liberty even outside of Argentina. Because if it works, then more and more people will start to take that idea on and say, hey, why can't we do that? And, we may start to see other parts of South America also say, hey, they got a libertarian. Or, I mean, obviously with Bukele and what's happened in El Salvador in terms of lowering the crime rates, as you well know, there are other South American countries who are looking at that and saying, well, hey, look at what he did. Why can't we do that? Why can't we have low crime as well and have actual liberty in our country too? And so I think it all helps whether you move to Argentina or not.
Well, look, I completely agree, Stefan. I want it here. I mean, I'm pro-democracy and won't be voting in the next election because who the hell do I vote for? I can't vote for the Conservative Party and I can't vote for the Labour Party because they're two strands of the same thing, which is big government, high tax, surveillance state. If there was an equivalent to Milei in the UK, a libertarian leader who was pro-small state and pro-freer markets and pro-Bitcoin, that's an easy vote for me to make. But I almost think it hasn't got bad enough here for someone to come.
You might be right.
It was so bad in Argentina. It's such a shit show, and it's been such a shit show for so long. They've been stolen from wave after wave for decades. That somebody come in and said, "Yeah, basically they're all full of shit. I'll wipe my ass with them." It's obviously an appeal. I think even the UK, somebody like that would come across as a bit of just a nutter at the moment. But I would love that. I hope it inspires a wave of
generation of people who are going to start reading Rothbard, right? Like, let's not kid ourselves. It's not that, half of Argentina went and read Murray Rothbard and now, they've all gone and read Man, Economy and State, this 1,000-page book. No, but more and more people are going to be curious about these ideas. And I think the interesting thing that's happened now is it's proven that libertarian populism can work, right? Like that you can get elected on this. Whereas historically, what we've seen in the libertarian world is these arguments between the sort of pure principled approach of like, hey, just tell them exactly, and this kind of, just be like a little bit more lower tax than the right-wing side and just sort of try to be a little bit more moderate, the kind of moderates or so-called pragmatics. And I think this win now is going to show people that you actually can win by being a libertarian populist and being explicit about it. But to your point, it is right, I think, to say that part of what drove this outcome is the culture of Argentina, that for so long they've had this big government, big socialist sort of thinking, this Peronist thinking, and that was an important part of the country's history, not in a good way, but that because of that and because of the high inflation, there have been so many people who've been driven to this point that they would vote for the anarcho-capitalist. Now, maybe other countries will start to see what happens there. And I think, the the pro sort of free markets people will point to examples like Singapore, to some extent Dubai, to some extent Hong Kong before maybe the CCP came in, maybe Argentina, maybe El Salvador will be other examples of this that other people will point to and say, hey, we want to be like that.
Well, there's a couple of points in that. Firstly, the leftists will definitely get scared and will continue to throw their attacks and say these people are extreme right, which is obviously nonsense. Have you seen the film Jerry Maguire?
It would have been a while ago. I've pretty much forgotten it. Let's be honest.
So there's a brilliant part in that film, but basically he works as a sports agent. If you've not seen it, or anyone listening, but he's a sports agent. He writes this manifesto called "The Things We Think But Do Not Say," and he delivers it to everyone's inbox. And it was how we should act as sports agents, and everybody loved it and read it, and they clapped their hands, and then they fired him because they knew they would make less money if they did that. And so he goes out on his own and he just represents one guy. And at the end, he gets him his contract. And there's this moment where they like see each other, him and the agent, and they have a big hug and it's really emotional. And there's another guy, another American footballer. He stood next to his agent. He says, why don't we have a relationship like that? And so what I hope is that things haven't got bad enough here in the UK for anyone to think, oh, let's have an alternative way. But what they may see is somebody who does reduce taxations, frees up the markets, has less bureaucracy, less interference from the state, and it leads to growth in the economy and growth and prosperity. And so hopefully we won't have to have it go to absolute shit in our country for people to try and bring this alternative option.
Right. And we've seen, and I know in the UK, there have been a lot of people struggling with cost of lockdown, cost of living crisis, right? Like because of the lockdown, a lot of people are they've got their heads in the sand. They don't understand just how much lockdown cost them. These last few years have been horrific for much of the world. Billions of people have suffered the destruction of their rights, the destruction of their businesses, the destruction of their jobs. And, the price is being paid now for a lot of people, sadly. So let's see.
Yeah, fingers crossed. You did mention specifically you don't agree with him on foreign policy. What in there is the things that you don't agree with? Is it just that he has foreign policy?
Well, I think I don't know exactly his policy or thoughts on things like Ukraine and Israel and things like this, but I believe a more, let's say, Ron Paul style libertarian would just be strictly non-interventionist. Whereas, the dialogue over the last, let's say, few years has been very, the American government should support Ukraine or the American government should support Israel, and this kind of aspect where I think a strict libertarian interpretation would just be, no, you're here to just make sure that your own people have, their rights and freedom. If you're going to be a minarchist libertarian, you would just say your own people should be free and have economics and this, prosperity. We shouldn't have an army that's out there trying to be the world police. And maybe that's an American specific thing, but it sounded a little bit like Javier Milei was maybe supporting some of that. So that's why I would say maybe on the foreign policy aspect, I'd probably disagree with him. He maybe is a little closer to the Zionist sort of perspective, it sounds like. So that's probably where I might disagree with him. And so, but nevertheless, Argentina is starting from such a bad position right now that, just getting these domestic things right in terms of deregulation and lowering the taxes and abolishing government departments, that may cause a big improvement in the average day-to-day life for Argentinians. And so, that's why I think, for some people, that's like a deal breaker, right? Like this aspect of like the foreign policy stuff, they think he's just not to be supported. But I think it's one of those cases where you need to wait and see and give him a chance to try and improve things in Argentina. Now, to be clear, there's a lot of things that could go wrong, right? There's a lot of things that could go wrong. He could.
What do you worry about most?
I wonder if there's maybe like an Argentinian deep state that he won't really be able to fight correctly. Maybe, but I don't know. Maybe I'm sort of paralleling or thinking about Trump and how he wasn't able to really do much. Now, I'm not a fan of Trump, but he sort of came in with this idea of trying to, drain the swamp and try to clean out the deep state when really it sounds like he was not effective at that. But maybe that's an American specific thing. I don't know. Maybe that's America. Maybe Argentina is a different case. And maybe it's really more just about abolishing government departments and just trying to bring back get the government out of the way. But yeah, things that could go wrong. Maybe he gets into his disagreements with Brazil and Lula or someone. There's lots of things that he could get sabotaged in various ways, or maybe he's kind of in a gridlock. Maybe he doesn't have enough power to actually abolish various government departments or lower the spending, lower the taxes, and so he's sort of stuck in this gridlock and not able to implement actual libertarian policies.
Yeah, I think there's the other one I worried about is that whether he would weaken democracy as a libertarian, but then become tyrannical himself.
So people have made this case as well, I think, historically, in terms of Latin America politics, that they say, it's swung from extreme to extreme. But I think in this case, he does seem to be a genuinely Austrian economist, right? Like, whereas historically people have looked at, let's say, Chile and said, it's the Friedman boys went in. In this case, I think he genuinely is interested in Austrian economics. He has written a chapter in a book praising Huerta de Soto, who is a well-known Austrian economist. And so I think economically, I'm expecting that he should be sound. But the question is whether he will be able to implement those things. And, like I said, we never really know exactly how things go. But I'm cautiously optimistic about what this means for the cause of liberty around the world.
Yeah. Back to the being strict in non-interventionist. What is the thesis behind that? Because I understand there's just, we seem to be in forever wars now. They're completely ineffective. But there have been times where there has been intervention, USA in World War II, I think Thailand originally, in Cambodia when the genocide was happening there, and anything that may have happened in Rwanda. There are cases, like genuine cases of genocide. What is the kind of thesis behind being completely non-interventionist?
So I think, firstly, it would be this case that why should the state go and do things by coercively funding, taking taxpayer funding to go do these other causes that those taxpayers don't agree with, right? If those taxpayers agree with it, they should go to war in those countries. They should fund the war in those countries.
So if you war bonded them, would that be okay?
I guess if it was voluntarily funded. But even then, there are cases where in the UK, for example, in World War I, they lied about the war bonds. As you may have, you've spoken with Lynn from her book, In Broken Money, she makes that point that they actually lied about the subscription rates on the war bonds to make it seem like there was public support for this thing. So that's one example. Another example would just be that the state is not effective in these things. Another example would be this idea of not having entangling alliances, right? Just trade with everybody and just don't have any entangling alliances. Just focus on your own patch and make life better for your own citizens, as opposed to trying to go out there and be the world police, as America has tried and failed at, sadly. Maybe that's a generous interpretation, right? Like that they were trying to do a good thing. And the not so good interpretation is that there's this, military industrial complex that's out there going out and starting wars around the world because, it sort of benefits them, or it benefits this class of lobbyists and military industrial complex and, Boeing and Raytheon and the like, that they benefit from it at the expense of, human lives, people who get injured, and, the cost and the foregone prosperity that could have been had if they were just trading and being bona fide libertarian capitalists.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, look, I massively appreciate your time. I knew I'd get all the answers I wanted. Just a couple more things. It's a 4-year term. You can only serve 2 terms. What does success look like to you in 4 years' time? And not your ultimate perfect view, but what do you want to see in a realistic kind of world?
Right. What would realistic success look like? Probably a period where maybe there's going to be some initial pain and struggle, right? It's short-term pain for long-term gain. That if he can lower the taxes, maybe he can attract international investment. Maybe people can start to save. People can start to increase their productivity and prosperity. I think that maybe there'll be an initial year of pain, and then maybe things can slowly start to climb up and out of that for Argentina. And hopefully by then, more and more people are bought into the idea of, oh, wow, actually libertarianism has sort of made things better for the country. and then maybe it can become a sustainable thing that, even, as you said, if it's a 2-term limit, maybe another person from the Libertarian Party there can get voted in the future, and things like that allow things to continue. But I think the important point I would make is that capitalism, as the term suggests, is about the accumulation of capital, and that takes time. And so to have nice things, it requires machinery and productivity, and it takes time to slowly build those up, right? It's like slow to build things, but very quick to destroy them. And so when you're trying to build things up, it can look like you're just paying this price unnecessarily compared to the other guy who's just kind of using the fiat printer and cheap debt to sort of outcompete you. But if you take that slow and steady saving approach and productive approach, you can end up being far more productive in the long term, because you haven't had all those big booms and bust cycles as the fiat printer style of growth will give you.
Which is never real growth anyway. And so I guess what you're really saying there is it's more like a trajectory. You're looking at a trajectory of better policy, as you say, government getting out of the way of people. And I guess it's going to be more kind of like subjective judgment with probably some objective data in there.
Right. So hopefully their productivity has gone up over time.
Yeah.
Hopefully life expectancy is going up. Hopefully poverty rates have come down. Inflation hopefully is at least a lot reduced. So I think those are some of the metrics that you could try to look at to kind of get a rough idea. What's the quality of life like for the man in the street, right? Is his life better? Is he actually able to look after his family, feed his family better than he could, under the Peronist regimes?
And I guess polling data in 4 years' time will be super interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. And what would failure look like to you?
So maybe he gets locked down in gridlock. Maybe he is not able to really pass many actual free market laws because the people currently in Senate and the House sort of force all these. What's the word when you give something up in a negotiation? Like I've forgotten the word, but basically they force him to put in all these concessions, like concessions in the proposals.
Concessions, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like they force concessions so that he can't realistically open the economy up. But I think, I think that's. I mean, it's possible. I don't really know enough about Argentina to sort of comment further than that. But I would say, that's probably one of the less successful pathways. If in 4 years' time Argentina has not started to come out of this crisis period, then it would look like a failure. Yeah,
well, it's quite interesting. I guess we're all just kind of sitting and waiting now, really. Like, what's the first thing he's going to do? But it's funny because I've known you for a long time, but there's like, during this whole interview, you probably don't realize there's this whole excitement, and like I see a different kind of, how do I put it? I don't want to sound cringy, but like there's a real positivity in the way you're replying to things. There's a real excitement. I guess this is an exciting time for a libertarian. It's exciting as a Bitcoiner, right? But as a libertarian, this must be just particularly exciting.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the funny thing as well, because some Bitcoiners who are maybe a little more statist or culturally lefty, maybe they weren't as happy about it. I'm not attacking you, right? But I mean, just
I'm happy about this.
Yeah, there were some who were, whereas I think those of us who are coming from a more explicitly libertarian view, most of us are happy about this, except for the ones who are kind of against everything or kind of people. Most are saying, I think this is probably, I mean, we can't guarantee, it's probably a good step forward, and it's probably going to encourage more people to learn about liberty and learn about Bitcoin. And I think that is a good thing for any Bitcoiner. So let's see what happens. I think it will be an interesting example to be able to point to and say, well, hey, they elected a libertarian in Argentina, and maybe things are going, hopefully, in a few years' time, if things are going well, then it's a good example that you can point to.
And we'll all be making our pilgrimage there like we do to El Zonte. So, like, Stephan, appreciate your time. I've always enjoyed our chats. I've learned so much from you publicly and our private chats and occasional disagreement. But I really do appreciate you always being available to me for this, because I have learned so much for you. Anyone listening, definitely check out Stephan's podcast, the Stephan Livera Podcast. It's amazing. A bit more technical than mine, but touches on some similar subjects. Anything else you're working on you want to send people towards?
Yeah, so stephanlivera.com. And of course, I'm also head of education at swan.com. So people who want to buy Bitcoin or learn about Bitcoin, go to swan.com.
I'm my man. Thank you, Stephan.
Thank you.
Appreciate you. Hopefully I'll see you soon. And I'm not sure where, but I'm sure somewhere in the world.
Yeah, I'll see you soon.